Hey folks, welcome back to the Contrarians. We have a really fun episode today. We are doing the regular Contrarian thing where one of us is in the hot seat. And today we have a special guest, and it's Tim again. And he's got a contrarian pick. He's got a really, really good contrarian pick. His last couple have been really good. So these are the types of albums that this show was like made for, is the type of album that Tim's going to pick today. We're doing the band Toto. Massive, massive band from the 80s. They have a lot of albums, a lot of platinum selling albums. And when we think about Toto, or when I think about Toto, and I'm thinking you folks at home too will think the same thing. When you think of, what's the big Toto album, it's usually Toto 4. I mean, we're talking about multi-platinum selling album, multi-platinum singles, massive hits. We're talking about Grammys, critical consensus. When you think of a band that has one type of album that almost overshadows the rest of the catalog, this is the perfect band because they've got a lot of great albums, and Toto 4 usually is the album that almost overshadows everything else in some ways, although there's other great albums too. Hydra's really cool. It's a little more proggy. The Debut, a lot of people like a lot. But I'm going to throw it over to Tim, and he's going to tell us a little bit about the band, and he's going to show us some of his cool. I wonder if Tim has an 8-track of one of these Toto albums, but I'm going to throw it over to Tim. He's going to show us some cool stuff, and he's going to talk a bit about the band and tell us what his contrarian album is. So take it away, Tim.
Thanks, Marco. I have some Toto 8-tracks. I didn't have any out for my props. Want these things to show up as well as they can. So Toto. They came out with the first album in 1978, but they were originally formed of 6 of the top session musicians in, I guess, LA. So you have Steve Lukather on guitar and vocals, David Page on Page, I've never been sure how to pronounce it, keyboards and vocals. David, spelled Hungate, but I think it's pronounced Hungate, on bass. The amazing late Jeff Porcaro on drums, and lead vocalist Bobby Kimball. That was the original 6-piece Toto and lineup. And those guys appeared on tons of albums even at that point. I believe that a lot of them got their start supporting or doing sessions for the likes of Steely Dan and Boz Scaggs. But if you go through the credits of the individual members of Toto, it spans popular music as far as songwriting and guest appearances and playing on, well, starting with the biggest selling album of all time, Michael Jackson's Thriller. That's got a ton of Toto guys on it. As a matter of fact, and I forgot about Steve Porcaro on second keyboard. So there were 3 Porcaro brothers at one point, because when David Hungate left, his brother Mike, who's also since passed away, came in. So it was a little bit like In Excess. You had 3 brothers in a 6-piece band. But Steve Porcaro co-wrote the song Human Nature, which alone, the residual royalties probably keep things paid quite well for him. But if you just looked at Steve Lukather as a guitar player alone, the list of sessions he's done, it's all over the map. It's anywhere from Michael McDonald, Elton John, Alice Cooper, Chicago, the Tubes, and 80s radio. A lot of times when you're hearing songs and you think, okay, it's a band, so it's their guitar player, it's actually Steve Lukather. Like when you hear She's a Beauty by the Tubes, that's Lukather on lead guitar. Running with the Night by Lionel Richie, that's Lukather on guitar. All Right by Christopher Cross, Lukather on guitar. Dirty Laundry by Don Henley. Like it goes on and on and on and on and on. And so in between those times, they would be doing their own albums, their own songwriting, and their own tours. So that's kind of the history of the band itself and what they did. But as far as their recorded history, first album, as you said, which is kind of your background, it's very cool, 1978. Right off the bat, I think this is like a double platinum album. Contains one of their signature tunes, Hold the Line, was a top 5 single. So they were off and running with this album. Next album, 1979, as you said, they got a little bit proggy. I think that they thought it was time they could stretch out a little bit. This is Hydra. Pretty cool for a second album. They allowed them a gatefold. And yeah, with song titles like Hydra and St. George and the Dragon, you might ascertain that this is a little proggier, but musicianship always top notch. The only quasi-hit single off this one was a song called 99. This went gold. It didn't do nearly as well as the first one. The third one came out in 1981, called Turn Back. This one almost sunk them as far as a recording band. It did not have any hit singles whatsoever, did not sell well in any parts of the world, even though it's a pretty good guitar-driven album for them. And I like the simplicity of this album cover here too, by the way. And of course, as you mentioned, the sober choice, I would have figured would either have been the one I'm about to talk about or the debut. Of course, Toto 4, I mean, what can you say? This album begins with Rosanna and ends with Africa. So, you know, it's pretty hard to argue with the success of it. And I didn't know this for many years, but if you notice, there's 4 rings around the hilt of this sword because it's their 4th album. They come back to that a little bit later. So, you know, as in good timing with all bands, of course, they lose their lead singer. Bobby Kimball is asked to leave. He's sort of like the, so they always had, usually always had the core of Steve Lukather and David Paich, both of whom sang, both of whom were perfectly good singers, but they always wanted the high tenor vocalist up front. Bobby Kimball was that high tenor vocalist. He looked a little bit like Burton Cummings. So he left. The word cocaine gets thrown around a lot, but I'm sure it was all of them at one point or another. But I guess for a vocalist, that's one of the worst things. So they get a guy named Fergie Fredrickson in, who used to be in a band called LaRue, and they do this album, Isolation. Also in 1984, sort of an overlooked Toto album. A lot of people don't even know about it. Oddly enough, there's a remake of this film that's out now. This is the soundtrack to Dune, which all of the music on this album is by Toto, except for one track, which is by Brian Eno. So it's kind of up in the air whether you consider this a Toto album or not. They don't in the numbering, but the fact of the matter is that 17 tracks, 16 of them are Toto. So then Fergie Fredrickson doesn't work out. Not great on the road is what I understand. So they get a guy named Joseph Williams, who is actually with the band even today, even though he left and came back. Bobby Kimball left and came back. It gets kind of confusing. Joseph Williams was a session singer, had recorded in his own right, has a very famous father named John Williams. Yes, composer John Williams. So these were all, like, most of these guys, their parents did film scores, or they did TV, or they it was just kind of born and bred in them. So anyway, the first album they did with Joseph Williams came out in 1986, Fahrenheit. And the biggest hit single off of that one, I've actually got a 45 picture sleeve to show you, the song I'll Be Over You, which is a ballad. And for Canadian fans, you'll be interested to know this. When I picked this up, it has a Zeller's price tag on it. $259 for this single. So Joseph Williams lasted for one more studio album, 1988, the 7th one. And this has 7 rings sort of around it, I guess. Minor hit single off this one with the song Pamela. They've got a million songs with girls' names. Then kind of a strange chapter in their history. They get a singer named Jean-Michel Byron, who was like an R&B singer, kind of more of a Michael Jackson type singer. Doesn't work out. They do 4, in my opinion, crappy new songs mixed with some classics on this album, past to present, 1977 to 1990. Which I'm happy to say for years, this was the only Toto best of. It is not a very good one. First of all, because it's got those 4 new songs, none of which are any good, in my opinion. And they left a few classics out. But that's since been supplanted by some better ones. At this point, they're down to a 4-piece. So they do an entire album with Steve Lukather on lead vocals. Pretty guitar-heavy, guitar-driven album called Kingdom of Desire, which came out in 1992, didn't come out in North America until 1993. Sadly, this was the last album that Jeff Porcaro played on. He died suddenly of a freak heart attack, and he was only 38 years old. And so they got to replace him. They got another super drummer, a guy named Simon Phillips, who has played with everybody from Judas Priest to Pete Townsend to, I mean, you know, Simon Phillips is like, you know, masterclass drummer. They do a tour for Kingdom of Desire, commemorated on this CD called 2 CD set called Absolutely Live, came out in 93. Next studio album came out in 1995 called Tamboo. Then in 1998, they came up with this album, which is called Toto XX, which symbolized 20 years since their first album. This is a collection of B-sides and unreleased tunes. Some pretty good stuff on here, but it's not really an album. The next studio album comes out in 1999. It's called Mind Fields. Bobby Kimball is back in the band for this one. And then kind of a rare one these days, and I don't even have it on CD. All I've got is this cassette from Korea or Malaysia or somewhere. They did a covers album called Through the Looking Glass. So this is kind of a rare one. And, you know, this is just a cheap compilation called collections. Sony put a bunch of these out. This is a 2-disc set called The Essential Toto, which is a really good compilation, and it's the one I would recommend to a casual fan. Then the story goes is they put an album out in 2006, which I don't actually have in physical form, called Falling into Infinity. That's kind of hard to find too. But in 2015, they put another album out, which is so far their last new studio album. The story goes is that they owed Frontiers Records another album, but instead of phoning it in, they decided to make, the definitive Toto album. And they came up with a really strong album called Toto 14. Which is close to my favorite Toto album, but it's not quite there. This reunited them with David Hungate. He came back and played on some of the songs. Joseph Williams is back on lead vocals. Good album, really good, strong album. Then 2018, they put this best of it called 40 Trips Around the Sun, another good compilation. It's just a single disc compilation. They put out a box set called All In, and there was a disc on it that came out in its own right called Old is New, which is another collection of unreleased songs. And again, there's some pretty good stuff on this. And they commemorated all of that with this live album, 40 Tours Around the Sun. And then they kind of split up, and there's litigation with Steve Porcaro and the rest of the band. David Page isn't in good health. He's off the road. But in recent months, Steve Lukather and Joseph Williams have revived the Toto name, and apparently they're going to go on, presumably with some new music. Oddly enough, earlier this year, they each released a solo album, which looked exactly the same. I'm not sure what the deal was there. And one other thing I want to show you, kind of one of the fluke things that happens when you hang around long enough as a band, your music starts to get cool again. So Weezer scored a big hit with their version of Africa. So Toto did the smart thing, and it got them a lot of press. They recorded a version of Weezer's Hash Pipe, and here it is on a green vinyl single. It's kind of cool. So that's the Toto collection, pretty much. Sadly, no 8 tracks, no. So now you're probably wondering what my contrarian choice is. Like Marco said, the 4th album is the sober choice, the choice most people would make, or maybe the first album. But my personal favorite Toto album, and what I think is the best, is this one, Isolation, 1984. This is the one album that Fergie Fredrickson was on. And, when you listen to Toto, they are a rock band, but because of the musicality and versatility with the band members, you get a little bit of a lot of variety. There's some songs that are very R&B, very soft, very pop, very 80s Chicago in places, I guess is a good way of putting it, or dare I say Air Supply. But when they have their rock songs, they're always very, very well done. They never phone it in, no matter what genre of music they're doing. But at their core, they're a rock band, but they can drift off into a little bit of other areas. As a matter of fact, on Fahrenheit album, there's a track that Miles Davis plays on. So, they venture into jazz territory. So, but this album is an album that I would recommend to anybody that likes 80s melodic rock that isn't necessarily into that sort of variety, because this is pretty good 80s rock, pop rock, whatever you want to call it, all the way through. There are no real gentle moments on here. There's a lot of cool guitar parts, some excellent riffing, of course, the way that they produce themselves. The guitar is not front and center. Fergie Fredrickson was a unique guy. He didn't work on the road with them, but on this album, he sounds great. Doesn't sound at all like Bobby Kimball or Joseph Williams. He kind of puts me in mind of John Anderson from Yes. Very, very high range as a singer, and just a smooth, clear voice. So yeah, when I first listened to this album, the vocals kind of did remind me of John Anderson a little bit. He doesn't sing lead on all these songs. David Page sings, Lukather sings. And I just think this is a really, really well put together collection of songs. Unfortunately, it didn't have the can't miss, the appeal, the immediate appeal to radio that the songs like Rosanna and Africa did. But I think this is a great album here. That's what the band looked like in '84, is a black and white shot. And then there's this sort of chair by itself. The other cool thing I have to show you is something I don't have many of, but I have a picture disc version of Isolation. which, these are, they say not to play these because the quality gets worse and worse and worse, but it's kind of cool. So it's got like the album cover on this side, and it's got that photo of the band on the other side. Now, what might people know off this album? The only real song, the song that really had any impact and is one of my favorite Toto songs, is the song Stranger in Town, which went to number 30 on Billboard in the US. I think it did a little better in Canada, went to number 18. Has a really, really cool black and white video that stars a guy by the name of Brad Dourif. And movie buffs know that name, I'm sure, or they at least know his face from a lot of different things. If you're a fan of the Lord of the Rings movies, he was Grima Wormtongue. He was on a very, very memorable episode of The X-Files. I want to say he was Lieutenant Dan in Forrest Gump, but that might be somebody else. But you look, you say, who's Brad Dourif? And then you look at him, you go, oh, that guy, him. So he's in that video. It's an awesome track. Should have done better than it did. There's a ballad on here called How Does It Feel? That should have been a big single. The title song is an excellent rock song. Like, really, there's nothing heavy on here. So really any one of these songs could conceivably have been released as a single. For some reason, it seems like the record company didn't have a lot of faith in their choice of Fergie Frederiksen, because Stranger in Town is David Paich on lead vocals. And the other single they put out as a video is the final song, Holy Anna, which again is a David Paich song. So they got a brand new lead singer, and yet they didn't come out with a lead single that featured him on lead. But the album, I believe, went gold. But, when you have an album that I'm not even sure how many copies that Toto 4 sold, but it's multi-platinum. And like you said, it swept the Grammys that year. 3 top 10 singles, 4 top 40 in all. And it just didn't live up to it. And it's a very different sounding album from Toto 4, even though the core players are still there. So that's probably why it gets overlooked. But I think it's worth another look. And since I started to listen to this band, it's like, man, this album's really good, and it might even be my favorite. And eventually it just rose and became the one that I listened to the most. So that's really all I have to say, basically, about the construction of the album. Tell me why I'm wrong, Marco. Where did I go wrong here?
Well, I mean, you picked a great band, because there's quite a few albums that I think folks that are a fan of this band consider to be underrated albums. Like, you could have gone with something like Kingdom of Desire and put up a good argument, and it would have been like just as compelling, right? Like, there's a lot of statistics about a lot of albums. And when you look at the ranking list, you'll see that there's a lot of shifting with the albums. Like, you could almost do the top 10 almost in any order, other than usually Toto 4 comes in place in some of the ranking stuff that I've seen, other than, Sea of Tranquility had Toto as number 1. And I'll get into that in just a second. Just quickly, like, what I thought about the album. I mean, I thought it was a great album. Very catchy, lots of hooks, musicianship, incredible, lots of upbeat songs, not a lot of ballads on this album, like you said. And, Frederiksen's vocals are incredible. But not only like are his lead vocals cool, but even on the songs like Stranger in Town that he didn't sing lead on, even his backing vocals add to the songs that he's not lead on.
They cut right through the mix.
Yeah.
He thinks he's such a high range singer.
Incredible. Stranger in Town's a great song. Angel Don't Cry. In terms of album sales and stuff, I mean, I'm going to try to blow through these real quick, but I mean, like, just look at the Wikipedia page and you look at like the album sales statistics and the charting statistics, and Toto 4 just has a list of all the countries that they were platinum in, and it's like a list like this. And then you look at Isolation and it's like US gold. You know what I mean? Like, you go back to Toto 4 and it's like platinum in Japan, platinum in France, platinum in Germany, platinum all over the place. Multi-platinum in the States, even their first album, they debuted with a multi-platinum album, which is incredible, and then Isolation was just like this drop off in album sales. So it's
just funny. Like you said, you're right. US gold, their home country. And but I mean, Toto 4 was the album that, the first album was a good start, but Toto 4 gave them a career. They could have toured forever on that album, really. But just US gold.
But even look at singles. Africa, 6 times platinum in the US. What an incredible album. Then you look at like set list stuff. So then you confirm what the band thought of their album set list, right? So number 1, Toto 4, right? Their number one played song ever, Africa. And then you go all the way down to number 9 before you see Isolation getting representation live. And the number one song off Isolation is Lion, that's played live. And then Stranger in Town, which is interesting.
It's interesting because I'm just looking at this live album that came out 2018, and those are the 2 songs. They do Holy Anna on here too, which is kind of surprising. But yeah, they do Lion and they do Stranger in Town. Actually, they also do Dune Desert Theme, which is interesting.
Yeah.
But yeah, not a well represented album. I know one that they seem to go back to a lot that is good, but it's never one of my favorites. They just seem to love the Tamboo album. They always do. I Will Remember, The Road Goes On. And yeah, you're right. There are a subset of fans that would argue for Kingdom of Desire. If you prefer just the strictly guitar driven stuff, you definitely Kingdom of Desire. It's a gritty, for them, it's a gritty album. The guitar tones are really, really cool. It's not overproduced. And like I said, Steve Lukather's a fine singer on his own. So he carried that whole album all the way through, singing the lead vocal on everything. But Isolation, I think, maybe it's because of Fergie's vocals that it's such a different sounding. Some of these songs, if you heard them, no pun intended, in isolation and not knowing who it was, you might not pen it for Toto. You'd say, well, that's an 80s rock song, but I don't know who it is. That's something that's traveled with this band. I believe that when people say faceless corporate rock, I think Toto are like the poster children for that, because unless you're into music, unless you know the personnel in the bands, there was no real star in this band. Like there was no Steve Perry, Lou Gramm, these guys that are way out front and are personalities and are well known. Like they had the core of the band was in the back, and they'd have a different guy singing the lead out front. And for a while, it was literally like for 3 albums in a row. So from Toto 4, Isolation, Fahrenheit, you had a different lead singer on each album. It's a little bit like Kiss in the 80s, where you had like 4 albums in a row with a different lead guitar player on them. But anyway, I stand by the fact that it's a good album. A lot of times the set lists are, I understand why certain albums win out as far as getting the songs picked. I mean, you go to see Toto, you're expecting to hear a lot from the 4th album, probably a lot from the 1st album too. There are songs that they just kind of have to play, and then they throw in these album tracks because the album sold so many copies that people are bound to know the songs. There's a couple reasons why I think even if a band likes an album, they won't throw songs in front live. You have to keep an audience entertained. And if you're doing a bunch of songs from a more obscure album, you're going to have that certain amount of diehards that are losing their minds in the audience. They just can't believe you're playing this. But most people are going to be like, well, I'm going to go check out the merch booth, or I'm going to go find out where the restrooms are. And then also sometimes you have a case where, I thought of this after we had filmed our Night Ranger episode. What is the point of playing a bunch of songs from an album that's out of print?
Right.
And you can only find used copies. Like it's not easy to find. It kind of defeats the purpose.
Good point.
But where, with Toto, I mean, I think all of their Columbia albums, with the exception of maybe Turn Back, I think they all went gold eventually. And Isolation, I mean, it probably went gold on the fumes of Toto 4 because people had got into the band and that was the next thing that came out. But which is a shame because for an album to sell, 500,000 copies just based on the album that came before it, I think it would be nice to think that it sold that many copies based on the music that was on the actual album. That's why I think people need to go back and check this one out.
Well, it's interesting. I want to go back to the point you made about Toto being like the leaders of faceless corporate rock or whatever you had said. It's interesting because I found an interview with Fredrickson where he talks about how he believes he was hired to give the band more of like a stadium rock type of feel to it. And what's interesting about that is this tour ended up being a disaster. Like they ended up canceling the European leg of this tour. Fredrickson in this interview, he says, I think they were looking for me to do that, which was to become more of a stadium rock type of band. And I think halfway through the tour, they were probably thinking they should go back to what they were doing as it wasn't quite working out. Because apparently they were like showing up to these auditoriums where it would be like half empty, or there'd be like lots of space between seats and stuff like this. So that thing didn't work, and that's probably why it didn't work out with Fredrickson in the end. Just to go back to some of my statistics, so we actually did a poll on our Patreon channel, which you can join as well. The link is in the description. So if you want your voice heard on these albums that we're covering, join us over at Patreon. So we did a Patreon poll. Number one was Toto 4, which came in with the most votes. Second was Hydra, and third was the debut. And then Isolation and the seventh one got some votes as well. Some of the comments from our Patreon folks. So the debut is a perfect combination. This is from Peter Jones. The debut is a perfect combination of rock, pop, R&B, and soul. It is heavier than people think and doesn't have a single wasted moment. Pure classic. Reed says, I only know the Toto hits, so 4 gets my vote by default. So that's an interesting point. I love the musicians in Toto and I'm a huge Steve Lukather fan, but the singles always seemed catchy, but too middle of the road. Maybe someday I'll actually explore the catalog. So Todd responds to that and says, one of Toto's secret weapons is the occasional complex and insane instrumental passage that sneaks up on you. This is most often found in the deep tracks, although The Bridge in Roseanne is a good example. There are subtle patches of brilliance sprinkled throughout their catalog. Also, there is David Page's beautiful piano sound. Don says 4. There is a reason Africa and Rosanna are the only 2 songs most people name first when asked to name a Toto song. Sonically perfected catchiness. Scott Ray says it was between the debut and Hydra. Love those 2 and never went back after Toto 4. Peter Kerr says Isolation has more song hooks than a fishing trawler. And then Todd says the 7th one should have been a monster hit. Incredible production and some of Luke's best solos. Listen to These Chains to hear the most perfect example of the Jeff Porcaro shuffle. I could listen to the drum tracks of that song on an endless loop. So it's interesting too, because to go back to the point of like, you know, other albums from Toto that could have been Contrarian, 14 could have been a pick. You had already mentioned that's a big one for you as well, right? The 7th one could have been a pick. And even the 3rd album, Turn Back, I mean, Pete Pardo talks favorably about that one as well. So Sea of Tranquility did his list of Toto albums ranked. His number 1, he said, was Toto the debut, but actually said that Isolation was his number 2, and it could have been tied for number 1 between the 2. He says Isolation's a terrific album, spectacular hard rock, amazing hooks, The Incredible Lion, Stranger in Town, should have been a bigger hit. Angel Don't Cry, the vocals just wail on that one. How Does It Feel? Endless. Isolation, the title track, amazing. Mr. Friendly, Change of Heart. You haven't heard Isolation? If you haven't heard it, you need to. Just to go through a couple of other lists real quick. Ultimate Classic Rock, their number 1 was Toto 4. Best Ever Albums, their number 1 was Toto 4. Ranker, their number 1 was Toto 4. And that's fans voting. Best Ever Albums is aggregate lists. And Ultimate Classic Rocks is their list that they put together. So they basically said the result of Toto 4 was a triple platinum smash that produced some of the group's best known and best loved singles, won 6 Grammys, including Album of the Year, and established the band as global superstars. The shadow cast by Toto 4 would prove all but impossible for the band to work past in later years, but the album remains a hugely entertaining chapter in West Coast pop history and a crown jewel in Toto's catalog. So their number 2 was 7th one. Their number 3 was Toto 14. Their number 4 was Hydra. Number 5 was the debut. 6 was Fahrenheit. 7 was Minefields. So for Ultimate Classic Rock, Isolation came in at number 9. And what they said about Isolation was Fredrickson acquitted himself quite well on this album, but the material didn't have the same radio-friendly bombast as its predecessor, and Isolation proved a commercial disappointment. Toto would go back to the drawing board in search of a new singer after 1 album. So that's what they said about Isolation. That's Ultimate Classic Rock. And they had Toto 4 at number 1. AllMusic gave the debut 14 and 4, all 4.5 stars. They gave Isolation 3 stars. They called Isolation a Journey clone album and said Isolation was anything but the kind of record those millions who had loved Rosanna were waiting for. It seemed intended to restore the band members' heady studio reputations as hard rock technicians, which it did by dispensing with the elements that finally made the band a big success in 1982. One user review I found, too bad this album did not get more attention. Every song on this album would have been a major hit for any other band of the 80s, but I guess Toto fans at the time expected something less poppy. Fergie Fredrickson's voice could have taken the band to new heights, but something must have happened. So just to go back real quick, Ranker had Isolation at number 7. Best Ever Albums had Isolation at number 7, and Ultimate Classic Rock had Isolation at number 8. So on some lists it falls kind of low, but then you go back to Sea of Tranquility, he had it tied for number 1. And a lot of folks think that this is an underrated album. So it was a great pick by you for sure. I don't know if you wanted to respond to any of that.
Yeah, it's funny. A lot of love for Hydra. A lot of people really, really like Hydra. Anyone who has a taste for prog rock, that's the Toto album they tend to go through, even though it's not really, there's only a couple songs that kind of go with that. But someone mentioned the instrumental passages. I mean, you know, they were as middle of the road as a rock band could be. I mean, they were played on AM radio, adult contemporary radio. You know, they're one of the yacht rock bands that, you know, they're considered to be, you know, in that style. Although, and if people only know like the popular songs, you need to think about Hold the Line and what a guitar-driven song that is. There are other songs in their catalog like that. You just got to kind of dig deep for them. I don't think Isolation sounds like Journey at all. Fergie doesn't sound like Steve Perry. As a matter of fact, I wonder if he ever was considered when John Anderson left Yes, because he could have taken the Yes gig. He really could have. If you listen to the way he sings, he's got that. It's that high soaring tenor where it sounds like it doesn't take him much effort to hit those high notes. Although in a Steve Lukather interview I read, who's pretty blunt about, you know, what went on at different times. I think this is from 2004 from melodicrock.com. Apparently he was terrible on the road. Like he couldn't sing as well live as he did in the studio. They captured him wonderfully in the studio. And yeah, you know, maybe it's funny, you know, people that are, you know, would laugh to think that they heavied up for Isolation, but compared to Toto 4, yes, they made a concerted effort to have more guitar-driven songs, less songs based on, you know, the R&B feel between, you know, the rhythm section and all of that. But, you know, as far as instrumental passages, even if somebody were to listen to Rosanna, try and duplicate that guitar solo, especially the end solo, some of the bends that Lukather does in that. I mean, the guy's just a genius, and he could play anything. I mean, like I said, the amount of different musicians from all different genres he's played with it's across the board. Now, he would usually be, you know, producers like David Foster and Quincy Jones, if they needed a rock guy, he would get the call because he was a rock guitarist essentially that just happened to be very, very, very versatile. You know, and Steve Lukather also was good friends with Eddie Van Halen, and it was he that suggested to Quincy Jones that you want Eddie Van Halen to play the lead on Beat It. Because all of the guitar on the Thriller album, any guitar that there is, that's all Lukather, except for that solo in Beat It. It's Jeff Porcaro on the drums on the songs that actually have drums, like Billie Jean. That's a pretty classic groove. That's Jeff Porcaro. Of course, the guy invented his own, there's a shuffle named after him, you know, the Porcaro Shuffle. That's that beginning of Rosanna. And Martin did an episode of History in 5 Songs where he gave 5 examples of that. Fool in the Rain by Zeppelin is another famous example. It's a really complicated pattern, but it sounds effortless. And that's another one of the things with these guys. They make it sound effortless, and maybe that's why, you know, yes, it's very slick. It's very heavily produced, but it's not phoned in music. It's very complex. So many layers of things going on. One of my favorite quotes about Lukather as a guitar player came from George Lynch, of all people. And it was kind of a backhanded compliment. He said, he's one of those guys that makes my life miserable. So he said, anything I can do, he can do 10 times better, and he does it effortlessly. So, I mean, he could hold his own with, you know, some of the heaviest bands. You just never know it because of the music that Toto made. But yeah, Turn Back, I love Turn Back. That's a dark horse album for sure, because there were no hits off. There were no number 30 hits off it. It was not a gold album. I don't even know if that album sold 1 million worldwide, even to this day. It disappeared. But it's a more guitar-driven album than people would think, too. There's songs on there that have some cool guitar in it, like English Eyes and Gift with a Golden Gun. Like this, it's good. But Isolation is the one I stand by because it's got all of those things going for it that I love about Kingdom of Desire and Hydra and Turn Back and the debut. But it's just catchier. The hooks, there's hooks galore on here. And I have to think that some record company nonsense must have gone on where they said, you know what? And I've heard of this. They wanted them to get Kimball back to get that recognizable voice out front. So they said, well, you know what? We're going to put the album up, but we're not going to promote it. That happens. You know, that's why Columbia never promoted the Joe Perry project. They wanted him back in Aerosmith. It's that I think that's why Geffen never promoted Blue Murder. They wanted John Sykes back in Whitesnake. It's sleazy, but it's the music business, right? That's basically all I got to say. It's a great album. You know, might surprise you. You may listen to it and think, I did not know that Toto did songs that were this rocking.
But I mean, even if you go back and listen to Kingdom of Desire, listen to like Kicking on the Walls on that one.
Yeah.
Gypsy
Never
Train
know
School.
how many times is in Drop D.
And you talk about like some of the instrumental stuff they do, Jake to the Bone on Kingdom of Desire. And then
that's an insane instrumental. They do that live too. They do it live and it sounds just like the album. It's amazing. Stop on a Dime, Time Changes. Yeah, it's good stuff.
Yeah, and then to go back to Turn Back at Goodbye Eleanor, I think Pete Pardo said it was like one of his favorite Toto songs, or like one of the most interesting Toto songs, you know?
Goodbye Eleanor is interesting because that was the single from that album. It's kind of like Detroit Rock City, which people would go, huh? No, it is. Listen to it. But it's good. And I got to mention, it's funny you mentioned that song. There is a video to that song, and they're in the studio doing it live. It's not the album version. At least Bobby Kimball's lead vocal isn't. But it's so cool because at the end of it, there's a big drum fill to finish it out. And then, you know, a big cymbal crash. And you just see Jeff Beccaro just, you know, doing all this stuff. And then he throws the drumsticks, gets up and walks away. It's almost like a mic drop. It's just the coolest thing. And I don't think he meant to do it, but it was like, that's all I got. Deal with it. Yeah, all of those guys were just ace musicians, but Jeff Beccaro was like one of the best drummers that walked the earth, and it lost him way, way too soon. A lot of tragedy in that band too, because, you know, Mike Beccaro died of it. He had ALS. Fergie Fredrickson has since passed on. I don't know if it was pancreatic cancer, but and again, I'm not sure what it is, but David Page is not like, he doesn't go on the road anymore. So there's something happening there too, which is, you know, just a fact of life. But there's just been a lot of tragedy in this band, especially like the two brothers passing away.
Yeah, this is a cool episode to do. I think you pretty much nailed it again with a good Contrarian album. Like, this was a great pick, and I think there's a lot of great picks for Toto. I think we kind of covered that, but I don't know if there's anything that you want to plug before we go real quick.
We got a really fun episode coming up it's going to be the final Tim's Vinyl Confessions of the year. It's a 1 year in review episode. Those are always a lot of fun. So me and three of my regular co-hosts did that. That's coming up at the end of this month. I'm not sure when this is going to come out, but people that have watched this know I'm a huge Y&T fan. I got a cool episode just focusing on their singles coming up, and just gonna keep plugging away. You know, I found that our the two types of episodes that seem to get the most views for the most part are the road trip episodes and the reviews by the year. So next year is going to be interesting because, you know, we can go back evenly. And going back to 1982 is going to be a long episode because I had a hard time narrowing that one down. It just seemed sometimes some years there just have to be a lot of bands that you like that release albums all in the same year. And yes, Toto 4 is definitely one of them for sure. So yeah, thanks. That's Tim's Vinyl Confessions. You can find me. That's my name on all the social media that I'm on. So appreciate it.
Awesome. So go check out Tim on his channel. Remember to like and subscribe to our channel. That helps us out a lot too. We also have a Patreon. We have some merchandise on TeePublic. The link is in the description. And other than that, thanks a lot for joining us, Tim. And I guess we'll see you next time.
That's it, dude.